Hi, everybody, and happy 2024. I'm really excited to be starting the year strong with an amazing episode from Bill Hunter, serial entrepreneur and medtech founder, founding companies like Angiotech and more recently, CEO and founder of Canary Medical, the company putting sensors on implants. You'll be able to learn more about where he got his inspiration from, his journey into being a CEO, his failures, his mistakes, and how he stumbled his way to success. This is a great one to get the year started. Enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Career Diaries by Elemed 2024. I'm super excited to be starting the new year with an amazing upcoming episode from Dr. Bill Hunter, founder and CEO of Canary Medical. Bill, welcome and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun.
I'm really looking forward to talking to you about your journey and also what's coming in the future in 2024 for Canary Medical, but also this idea that we touched on stumbling to success. But before we jump into that, tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm just a normal kid who grew up wanting to be a doctor. And so I went to medical school and practiced medicine for a while, but more by accident than by design, speaking of stumbling. The work I had done in graduate school before I went to medical school ended up becoming the drug-coated stent. So I decided to take a little bit of time away and work on this stent thing, which I thought would be a kind of year research project, and that was it. And it ended up being a very successful product. We took 70% of the world market. It was, at the time, I think it was the most successful medical product in history. And so that completely consumed my medical career. And I spent 22 years running Angiotech and building that business out. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. And then did a short tour in Spec Pharma, running a public company there. And then I started Canary, which is about putting sensors on devices. Angiotech was drugs on devices, and this was sensors on devices. So I totally lost my way and ended up in medtech.
It's an amazing story because Angiotech was a huge success, and you know the idea that you're taking devices and you're putting drugs on devices, and now you're putting sensors on devices. What do you think is going to come in the future?
It's funny that you mentioned that. So the premise behind Angiotech was really straightforward, actually, right? So medical devices get infected, they get inflamed. Pharmaceutical companies make anti-infectives, anti-inflammatories. Why don't we put them together? And when we started with the drug-eluting stent, and particularly when it was such an enormous commercial success, I thought that was going to unlock a wave of what I would call bioactive implants. So I really thought that almost every device would have some sort of drug, right? I mean, you can think about what you'd put on a heart valve. You can think about what you'd put on, almost anything, a hip, a knee, anything. And we really thought that was going to, bioactive would be the next wave. And it didn't really happen that way. There was a couple of things that happened. There was anti-infectives, there was anti-restenotics. There's little bits and pieces here and there, but it wasn't like every device went that way. And so I'm cautious even now as I sit with Canary, because I tell people, hey, I think it's ridiculous that every device should be self-reporting. It should tell their docs what's going on. It should give the patient information about how it's functioning. It makes perfect sense. And 5 years from now, everybody's going to have a smart implant. Well, maybe not, but I think that this whole digital health intersection is real. I can't imagine that medtech's going to be the only analog business in the world. Every other business is transforming. I do believe that the intersection of data and medical devices is the next big wave. I really do.
So your role as founder and CEO, because I think that's also important to say that the role of founder and CEO, being one myself, different to being a CEO of a company that you haven't founded. Can you speak to that a little bit? How do you see the difference?
Yeah, I've been CEO of 3 companies in my life, and the one in the middle, I came off the board to help. And so that was the one I didn't found. I was founder of the other two. I think that founding a company is a little bit more like starting a family. Um, you bring people together. It certainly has a totally different feel. It's not corporate at all in the beginning. It's an interaction between friends and colleagues. It's a group of people who decide they want to try something together. And so there's no real hierarchy. There's no real, business card syndrome, as I like to call it. Everybody's, they're on equal footing, and you're trying to set a path together. In a traditional company, it's very different. You come in to fill a very specific role with very specific expectations, with existing boards and existing shareholders, and very, very different. There you really do feel like you have been hired for a specific job. And it's really more of a job. And the first one is really more of a passion, I think.
So if we go back to Angiotech,
Mm.
so it was you, working on this project that you thought was going to take a year, and
Yeah.
then in the end ended up having a company that was ended up being a huge success. Talk me through like how you went personally through that transition of, inventor, ideator,
Yeah.
all to actually running a hugely successful company.
Yeah. Well, like most things in life, it started very serendipitously. So I was, I think I was third year medical school at the time, and I was asked to give vascular rounds, and I was talking about my area of research, which, cutting to the chase, was how blood vessels grew and how to stop blood vessels from growing, a process called angiogenesis. And how, if you could do that therapeutically, it would be useful in different aspects of medicine. And since it was vascular rounds, vascular growth seemed like an appropriate topic. So that's what I was talking about. An interventional radiologist who trained at Guy's Hospital, incidentally, came up to me afterwards, and he said, "Hey, you should put that on a stent." And I said, "What's a stent?" And he said, "Well, there are these new little cages that we put in to hold open vessels. And, if you could stop the vascular growth on top of these, you'd have a really, really good stent." And so we truly just went out and had a drink and talked about it. And he said, "Hey, I think we could get this approved in, 2-3 years. It would cost $250,000. Took us a decade and cost us almost $500 million to do it." But we just embarked upon it because it seemed like a nice research project. Nobody was going to leave their day jobs. Nobody was planning on, a career change. This was just going to be a project that we thought would be a lot of fun to do. And, to the root of your question of, how you go from there, it actually just kind of happens. If I had known on day one that we'd have to, raise all that money, and we'd have to build facilities, and we go to, a couple thousand employees, and we'd have manufacturing and partnerships and all this, you never would have done it. But the nice thing is it's kind of spoon fed to you a little bit at a time. And it's not until 10 years has passed and you look over your shoulder and you say, "Oh my goodness, that was a really long journey." But at the beginning, you have no context of the journey. So you're quite naive. And I think it's your naivety that actually saves you.
Yeah, definitely, because you don't know what you don't know, right? And you're just going for it and trying. So
It's actually, just to finish right, it's actually harder the second time because you do know. And when you do know, you're far more apprehensive, actually. So Canary, I was a little bit more, trepidatious because of it. Whereas the first time through, it was like, "Hey, all right, we got to do this. Excellent. How do we do it? Let's go." And actually, experience can be a hindrance, not a help in starting businesses, I think.
So at what point with Angiotech did you realize, oh my God, we're going to change the world with this product?
There were two moments when we did the first big animal studies, and they came back, and we looked at each other and said, "This works." And then the second was when we did the big pivotal trials. And I remember sitting with the CEO of Boston Scientific at the time, was Jim Tobin, and all my management team was there. All his team was there, and we were opening the results from the trial. And so Jim got to see them first because he was the CEO of Boston Scientific, and he just opened them up and he laughed. Like he didn't even say anything. He just laughed and handed, over. And, the restenosis rates, the failure rates had gone from, kind of mid-20s, low 30s in diabetics down to 1-2%.
Wow.
And we knew at that point that, that would be almost an insurmountable commercial advantage over bare metal stents. And it was, I've never experienced anything like it before or even since. It was quite something.
How does it change your perspective on the way that you look at the future when you have a moment like that where you realize that you're really onto something incredible?
It has two effects. I think it gratitude and a strange sense of fear. The one thing about being a classically trained scientist is you do realize that most everything you try is not going to work. And so when something actually does work, you realize that you've caught lightning in a bottle, and hopefully you have a sense that luck and good fortune played a very big role in that. It's not all attributable to yourself, and you've been very fortunate. And then you kind of have this other awareness of, what am I going to do next? Like, how am I ever going to top that? And I've probably spent 20 years chasing that since. So it's terrifying the next day when you're like, okay, well, what do you do for an encore on that? Catching lightning in a bottle is not a viable business model. So how are we going to find something to follow on?
It's and it's something that I do wonder about you, because you had this enormous success with Angiotech, and you could have just stopped, right? Like, I mean, you could have just gone, you know what, I'm done. I don't know, I'm gonna buy some nice properties, live on a beach somewhere, But actually, you continued, and then you went on to found another idea, which is, we'll talk about that more in a second, but Canary Medicine. But what motivates you to actually want to keep going and doing it? Because it must be stressful.
Yep. I know we're going to talk about failure at some point, but Angiotech ran its full course, and it ended up, it was extremely successful for 10, 15 years, and then we had 5 pretty tough years, and ended up selling it into private equity. And the first move the management team made in the private equity was to get rid of me. So I had that, I had that full cycle. And you keep going, I think, for a number of different reasons. I had started I got a CEO job, quote unquote, when I was 28, 29, and I was only 49 when I left Angiotech. And I didn't want to just do nothing, and I didn't want to come home to my kids and have them just see dad sit around and rest on his laurels. So it seemed very, there was never a moment I didn't think about rolling my sleeves back up and going back in. And now that I've been through this a second time, I've actually enjoyed this second journey even more than the first one, because I think you're just more appreciative when when you've struggled to get back to that place. And now I feel just the opposite. I can't imagine ever not working in this. They'll probably have to drag me out of the office when they tell me I'm not capable anymore, because I just love doing this. So.
But then you've probably invented the next product that will keep you going for hundreds of years. Who knows? But okay, so let's talk about failing then, because this is and honestly, Bill, like, be really real with me here, because sometimes I ask this question of people and I get really corporate, really glossy answers that are kind of super high level. But I mean, this is all about knowing the person, knowing the career journey. So let's talk about leadership lessons, because you're very inspiring on LinkedIn and you write a lot about leadership. So what are, like, kind of 3 big lessons that you've learned through actually failing?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first lesson you touched upon, starting a business and founding things. And so for people who are just sitting around that first piece of paper and trying to come up with their business, I would give them this one piece of advice. You never really know who's going to do what. And so there's a tendency that when you sit down, if you've got three founders, you say, hey, we're going to split the business three ways. You're going to do this, you're going to do that, I'm going to do this. And it just never turns out that way. And it's not because people aren't diligent or it's just, that's just not how life works. I was a medical student, and my other two founders were my graduate professor and and Lindsay McCann, a very famous interventional radiologist. You would never have assumed that the medical student would end up being the CEO for the next 20 years. That was just not how it happened. And so, I'm the only one who ended up working in the business. And so we had this kind of distorted view of how things were going to go. And so the second time around, I did the opposite. I said, hey, we're each going to take some ownership position on this, because I had several founders at Canary, but I'm also going to take a hunk of the company and I'm going to put over here, and I'm going to leave it there for a while. And a year from now, 2 years from now, when the roles develop and people end up doing different things, and some will devote their entire lives to it, some will not, we'll allocate again and make sure that it's split the right way. And that's something I like to point out to people, because it's not a piece of advice anybody ever gave me when you're starting a business, but it's actually not a bad one. The second thing that you've heard me write about is that it's so easy to get caught up in the startup need. A startup's a very needy partner. And it's very easy to stop exercising and stop looking after yourself. And, I used to be 50 pounds heavier than I am now. And when I reached 46, which was the age that my father died, I said, this just is not sustainable. And my chief medical officer came to me and said, you're going to be dead in 4 years if you don't start taking care of yourself. So, I started running and taking better care of myself. And so the second thing I always say to people is, even though nobody tells you to do that, they give you business advice about how to raise money, how to do different things. If you don't look after yourself, then the business tends to just kind of consume you and take over you. And you really do need to look after yourself. And again, something nobody ever told me, and I wish they had. I had to learn that on my own. And the last thing I always say was a piece of advice that one of my board members gave me, which is, again, about kind of managing all that goes with running a startup. And he said, there's kind of three major things in your life. There's your career, there's your family, and then there's whatever you do for yourself, your personal, ambitions or hobbies or whatever it is you like to do. And he said, even though everybody tells you that you can be great at everything, you can do all three, you really can only do two.
Yeah.
And there's no right answer. So just, you can only pick two, though. Like you're never going to be good at everything. And if you're going to run a startup, you've just used up one of those, right? Your job is going to be one of those two. So now you got two choices left, right? And you can only get one of them. So choose them really wisely. And I think that was really profoundly good advice, in that, for me, my choice was my career, my family, my kids, and I'm glad I went that route. But it's amazing how many people, want to play golf 4 times a week and want to spend a bunch of time with their family, and then can't understand why they're being asked to be CEO, or, the CEO who spends all their time on personal endeavors and then can't understand why their kids don't know who they are. Right. So, those are the three things I could pass on to somebody that I think are generic enough, regardless of the business, that's probably be what they would be.
So that's really interesting advice as well, because it's like, I want to just touch on one of them, which is around the idea of like taking care of yourself, right? What are your thoughts on the concept of separating out work and life? Because I speak to different people, different executives that have different ideas around this sort of thing, and I'm interested in your perspective. Do you completely separate, or do you float?
No, I think it's just the opposite. If I'm honest with myself, I think I've probably wedged my life into my job, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And what I have found is that you really have to schedule. So you have to schedule time with your kids, and you have to, my assistant Dina, has been with me forever, does she doesn't just manage my work calendar, right? She makes sure that I'm there for the events that really, really matter. And we sit down with the month and we populate the calendar with everything, not just with personal things and with professional things. And so it actually takes a lot of intervention to make it work, because in this job, there's just so many appointments that come up randomly and they happen all the time, and you're trying to wedge in all the time. And it's so easy to skip the other stuff. But I found if it's there on the calendar, then other things don't get scheduled in it. So I think, the big part is looking at managing your life in its entirety, not just, going from appointment to appointment.
How do you prioritize? Because you're super busy. I know that because I've been trying to get you on the podcast for quite a while. But also, you seem to be very active on LinkedIn. You've participated in, you talk at events. You're doing a lot of different things, and that's just externally facing that I can see. And then, of course, you've got a lot of things coming at you internally. What is your system for deciding where you spend your time and where you don't?
Yeah, well, when my kids were small, you wouldn't have seen me on LinkedIn or doing anything, because that occupied all my time, and it was really about that. And in fact, in my first contracts, when the company got big, I didn't ask for golf memberships or company cars. I asked that my family could accompany me on business trips 4 times a year. That was my perk, and they did. So my kids came all over the world with me. We had 8 facilities, manufacturing facilities around the world, in Europe. We had offices in South America. So my kids got to go to a lot of different places, and they remember that well. And my colleagues will remember my kids at our Christmas parties and all kinds of different things, and that's what we did. Now that all my children, my 3 kids, are all in university right now, it's just the opposite. So my second pillar now, I can write as therapy and do things like that. And I can do appearances. And so that pillar has moved up, I guess, to go back to my first analogy. But I have really tried to not overdo things, because you really can quickly find yourself, completely overwhelmed if you say yes to everything that comes along.
Has it ever happened to you that you have been just completely?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And if I'm brutally honest, I bet you it happens to me once a year, where somebody will sit me down and say, okay, like, we gotta just clear the decks here a little bit and kind of press reset, because, you do suffer from velocitization, right? It comes in, and you keep going faster and faster and faster, and then faster starts to feel normal. And the one thing I realize that's important when you break that down is that if you fill all your appointments, if you have an appointment nonstop, you're from 8 till 5 and it's steady appointments, you actually fall dramatically behind, because you do have work to do as a CEO. You have actual stuff you have to do, your job. And then you see all of a sudden you're doing your work from 5 o'clock till midnight, and that's when things get out of balance, right? So you do have to schedule time in there for just doing your job. You need it. I always say to my assistant, that's not white space on my calendar. That's actually the time I need, to function and do the things I need to do.
Are you familiar with the rocks, pebbles, sand concept?
Not intimately, no.
I found that really helpful to that point. So it's like, I think it's from Traction, but don't quote me.
The jar and yeah.
So you pick up the jar, and then you have these different things that you need to get done, and you've only got a certain period of time to get to do them. So if you put in the sand first, and you fill up the jar with sand, and then you put pebbles in, and then you try and put these big rocks in on the top, it doesn't fill up it overflows the jar, right? And it can't all fit in neatly. Whereas if you put in the big rocks first, then the pebbles, and then you pour in the sand, you'll find that it is all nicely fitting inside of the jar. And so I took that concept because I had the same challenges. And so I actually block out time called rocks in my diary, and it's for those big important bits of work that you need to do, to allow you to actually carve out the time to do it. So there's a tip from me, Bill.
There you go.
If you want to learn something from me, there you go.
I will incorporate that.
So let's talk about the growth stages of a company and how it changes when it comes to people and culture. Because obviously, as you said, you became a CEO, I think you said at the age of 28 on paper.
Yeah.
So talk me through sort of like the different stages of as the company grows, how does the CEO role look differently? And then also how does the company culture change?
Yeah, there's an old saying that as soon as you hire your first person, you now have politics. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. What I have seen is that culture is really influenced by employee number. So when you start out, and it's a group of people who usually know each other, have common interests, common values. That tends to be how a lot of businesses get started. And you can manage at the pub on a Friday night. Those can be your staff meetings. That's how you can do things. And there's perfect communication. There's perfect transparency. Everybody knows what everyone is doing, and so you are very efficient, and you do tend to make progress quite quickly. You have definite limitations, as you well know, because you don't have the subject matter experts in all the areas that you need, but you can certainly get going quickly. And so I think you can kind of manage by personality to 10, 15, 20 employees. Then if your organization is successful, right around employee number 20, you start hiring professionals. You go to people like yourself and you say, here's the gaps in my management team. These are the people I need to hire to do certain things. You probably hire your first big company executives. In our business, it's usually you don't have any idea about regulatory. You don't have anybody who's actually been through the whole regulatory process, or maybe the money raising process or the corporate finance process. All of a sudden you find yourself hiring a CFO or somebody in regulatory. And now you're bringing people who come from big organizations, have professional backgrounds, have expectations for how a company should be run. And that's when you start to see order start to occur. I alluded to it earlier, what I call the business card syndrome, where people now have a title, and that title means that they have domain knowledge and expert, not just expertise, but responsibility for that particular aspect and all that goes with that. And they start to manage parts independent from you. So that's a really hard transition for you. You're used to managing everybody. Now you're managing somebody who manages somebody else. And if one of your founders is now a layer down, you have a whole unique cultural issue. Then the third piece comes at about 100 employees. And I always say that, the military keeps their platoons at around 100 because it's very hard to manage beyond that. So they tend to split them up at about 100. And you see that in organizations as well. We just went through that at Canary, and now you have definite structure, and now you need infrastructure. You need HR, you need legal, you need all the support functions. You can't just wing it anymore. And that becomes, you become even more of a corporate entity. And then the last one kind of comes at 1,000. And when you're at 1,000, now you are a diversified corporation. And now you can no longer, stand up and greet everybody that comes in the door and orient them to your culture and values. You now have to do that in a more structured and regimented way. You have to have processes in place to teach people about your company and your mission and values and all those things, the things you used to do kind of intuitively as a CEO. So it really does kind of migrate along how many people you have, and it really does change the culture as you go. And even though everybody would love to have a startup culture with 5,000 employees, I think you can have a startup mentality. I'm not sure you can have a startup culture.
So how would you see the difference then?
I think you can still be aggressive. You can still lead that way. I've always said that strategy isn't what you say, it's what you fund. And so if you continue to fund, R&D programs, if you continue to fund, those types of things, then you're sending the message to the organization that this is an innovation R&D driven program. If on the other hand, all your funding is M&A and sales and marketing, then your R&D team's going to quickly figure out that that's no longer the essence of the company. So it's still possible to maintain the values. It's still possible to maintain what's going on, but it can't be a random walk anymore. You need structured processes in order to manage that. People need retirement plans, and they need HR functions, and they need all kinds of things, and that's just the way it is. They need healthcare, so you have to get a little more organized.
And also, it's a different kind of person that will join your company at different stages, right? And with
Yep.
different motivations. And so, you need to build your company, so that you are attracting the people that you
Yep.
can attract to your company. And so, as you said, like you hire people and they come with certain expectations, they're not
Yep.
all the founder of the company. And so they will
Yep.
come with expectations and standards and limits as well. And so, it's the job of the company to try to navigate through that, to be
Yep.
attractive for talent, but also get the best out of them as well when they do join, and keep them.
I have a process I put in place when a company is going through a rapid growth phase. So when you're going from like 20 to 100, or you're going from 100 to 300 or 400, companies rarely go like this. They tend to go like that, right?
Yeah.
You have these step functions. Come on. So when we're in one of those step functions and we're going to transition from one type of company to another, after somebody has accepted a job, I make them have one last interview with me. And I bring them in and I'm like, look, you've got the job, so that's not why you're here. I'm here to explain something to you, right? Which is that, we're a 20-person company, we're a 30-person company, right? Whatever we are, and we're in this stage. This, you used to work at J&J, or you used to work at Medtronic. This is not that, right? And so one of two things is going to happen. You're going to really love the chaos that's here, because it is chaos. Or you're going to run screaming from this place in 2 weeks, right? So first off, if that happens, no problem, no harm, no foul, I understand. Second thing is, I want you to think really hard about where you are in your life. It's easy to do a startup at the first part of your career when you don't have young kids and responsibilities. It's easy to do it at my age, at the other end of your career, where you have the freedom to make those choices. But if you've got a couple of kids in private school and bills to pay and a mortgage, this may not be the right spot for you, right? I mean, our businesses are not as solid, they're more volatile. So make sure that this fits with where you are in your trajectory. And about 20% of people will look at me and say, thank you. I was really worried about that. You're right. I need to, have a job at a big company that's more solid and has the benefits and the things I need. And, and the other people, they're like, no, this is a challenge I want. I'm ready to go. But I always do that last double check.
Yeah.
Because it really is a dramatically different culture than big companies. Anybody who says that, this is a small company with a big company culture, or any big company that says they have a start, they don't. You can't fake hunger, and small companies are always hungry, and big companies, don't have resource constraints the same way, and so they behave differently, and that's just a fact.
I think it's really brave that you have that conversation with your finalist candidates, because at least in the verticals that I recruit, these are people that are really hard to come by. It's hard to find good people. And so what you're saying is, you get a really, really good person that you want to hire, and you get all the way to the last stage of the process, and then you basically tell them that there's a chance that they might not like it, and you have that really straight expectations conversation with them. But what about, I'm just playing devil's advocate, by the way.
I lost a great candidate about 2 weeks ago.
What about, what if you have an amazing person that you're like, oh no, I really hope that they actually do, like, just go, you're right, I'm not going to go for it. And then you have nobody else in the pipeline.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I believe particularly in small companies that it really is a relationship, right?
Yeah.
And that, one of the other things I do in our recruiting process, a lot of times I may be the last person to interview, and it's not actually for me to sign off. I think a lot of my executive staff think that, but it's not really. It's to kind of have a cultural check, and I start those interviews by reversing it, and I say, all right, so what do you want to know about us? What do you want to know about who we are?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, because I'm very, very fortunate. I have a group of people that have followed me through 3 companies now. And that was because we had very clear understandings of how that relationship was going to evolve. And it's not just about what the candidate brings to the company, it's about what the company brings to the candidate. And I think it's really important to have that discussion with the candidate and say, here's who we are, this is what we do, this is what it's going to be like to work here. Is that attractive to you? Does that, recruit you into us? Does that sell us to you, not the other way around? Yeah. And when you get that right, you tend to have the long lasting, relationships that go forward. And when you don't, they tend to unwind as soon as there's any kind of stress in the business. And since in startups, there's almost continuous stress in the business, it's better to get that on the table right up front, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So if we talk about the role of a CEO, we did a leadership series recently, and there was a question that was asked by one of the audience that said, if somebody's end goal is to be a CEO of a company,
yes,
what roles or what experiences should they be trying to collect along their career in order for them to achieve that CEO role?
So I'll start with a disclaimer that I never climbed the corporate ladder. Yeah. So it's the only job I ever have. My CV is very bizarre. So I can't speak to, what it would take to rise through the ranks at J&J or Medtronic. I just don't have that experience. I look at, for example, how J&J rotates their executives through all kinds of different aspects to give them well-rounded training. I think that's probably what you need to do if you want to run a multinational. Mm-hmm. I think if you want to do a startup or you want to work in the small end of the business, it's probably just the opposite.
Really?
I think what you want to do is be really good at something. Whether that's science or finance or whatever, but be an expert at that. Surround yourself with the people from the other fields that one needs to build a company, and then just try it. Because the nature of smaller companies is that everybody gets involved in everything anyways, right? Yeah. If you're a finance person, you learn about funding R&D, you learn about regulatory, whether you want to or not. HR probably reports to you early on, and so does IT. And next thing you know, you've got this pretty well-rounded, how you do things with, chewing gum and baling wire in a small company. And then, you do that for enough time, you probably are ready to go take a shot at it yourself. And maybe the best way to be a CEO is to just go start your own thing or join a startup group and see what happens. So I think they're very different routes, depending on, which part of the industry you see yourself personality wise as a better fit.
Yeah, exactly. And we try to talk a lot about this as well, like in terms of like trying to educate the market around career paths, because it really, no path is a straight path. It's always a squiggly line in various different directions. Yep. But it's good to get an understanding of like the kind of environment that you want to be in, because the dynamic of a small business is very different to a well-established corporate name, and it requires different skills as well when you're in there, when you're in leadership roles. So let's on the idea of like stumbling again. Yes. Hear about some of the big stumbling blocks you've had in your career.
That's a good question. I mean, the phrase, by the way, is credited to the CEO of 3M, and was being interviewed about developing a glue that didn't stick. And what turned out to be an accident became, Post-it notes, which became a huge bestseller. And the interviewer said, how do you stumble into these things? And he said, well, you got to be moving to stumble. Yeah. And I think that's very true. I think small companies die for probably 3 reasons. I mean, one is your technology doesn't work and you can't do anything about that. Yeah. The second is that you run out of money. And you've got to really try hard to make sure you don't do that. And the third is from inertia. You stop stumbling, you stop moving. As you said, the pathway is never straight. And so, but if you say, hey, we're off track here, and you stop dead and you try and retool, that doesn't work. You have to just keep trying to find the path through the forest, and you've got to keep moving, even if it's in the wrong direction. So I think, those are the lessons I've learned in terms of failure, right? I mean, when you can never have too much money, right? I've seen many many founders who were worried about dilution, were worried about losing control, were worried about the venture capitalists telling them what to, whatever the case may be, but it was really always about control. And they wouldn't raise the money. They felt that, you know, if they no longer had 51% ownership, they were never going to be able to, it doesn't work that way. I don't know how many board meetings I've done in my career, but it's a lot. And I can't recall ever having a board vote that wasn't unanimous, not even once. I mean, you know, not even one negative vote. We talked through things. We came up with the right answers. We usually did what was right for the business. And so this concept of control and finance is misplaced. What you want to do is build a really big company. And so the first most common mistake, and a mistake I made early on in my career, was equating ownership with control and, you know, being able to manage it. Nobody can manage by, you know, holding your share certificate. So, you know, you want to raise as much money as you can. You don't want to ever run out of money. And you always want to be moving on different fronts. And the last mistake I made, which probably cost me my career at Angiotech, was you have to always be thinking 5 years in the future. One of the things you talked about, having a big success. Well, the problem is it's also very intoxicating, and it gives you so much latitude, because, you know, that product just printed money. It just, every quarter a big check came in, and you lose your hunger, and you lose your, you know, taking chances and all the things that got you there in the first place. And I wasn't quick enough to diversify. I wasn't quick enough to have a follow-on product. And when, you know, the tap started to turn off, there wasn't something there waiting to take its place. And so the other thing that I've learned the hard way is that you always have to have a pipeline. You know, you look at Canary, we have our smart knee. I'm really proud of it. It's very cool. I think it's going to be a you know, really dynamite product, but we already have other things coming right behind it, you know, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. And, you know, just because you're successful, unless you're going to sell the business, unless you're going to walk away, you got to make sure that you continue to have a steady flow of things behind you. And I think a lot of people fail to do that. I've seen that sitting on numerous boards. It's kind of one and done. And if you want to be a sustainable business, you have to have a pipeline behind it.
Yeah. Yeah. To your idea of, like, you know, it matters what you fund and where you spend your money in, and in medtech, that innovation pipeline is so important. And
your shareholders are going to say, take all that cash, dividend it out, or, you know, save it, make the stock price go up. Don't be taking high risks. Don't be doing that. And in fact, that's probably the wrong thing to do. You need to continue to be taking risks, and you need to continue to be pushing the edge if you're going to be an innovative company, right?
Yeah.
Totally different strategy if you're buying revenues and you've already got a big sales force. But if you're still on the innovation arm, you've got to continue to try.
So talking about innovation, let's talk a little bit more about Canary. So you guys are sitting kind of in a really interesting space right now, at the cross section of like the digital end, and also medical devices, you know.
Yes.
And what are you seeing as some of the challenges right now in digital?
You know, I mean, first and foremost, there are two industries and talent bases that have not historically been put in contact with each other.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't want to come across as if it's a stereotype, but think about what we do. So we take all this data from the knee, we do machine learning, you know, we use that to do diagnostics and predictive analytics. And I mean, machine learning's only 11 or 12 years old, right? I mean, Geoffrey Hinton's lab was just doing deep neural networks, you know, 12, 13 years ago. And they didn't become mainstream until a relatively short time ago, right? And so there's nobody out there with 30 years experience in deep neural networks, right? So the people that you are hiring who actually are experts and actually have the most experience are pretty young. Usually they're you know, first job, second job, just out of labs, and they're doing some very serious and important stuff in your company. On the other hand, your engineering team, who's, you know, building an active implant and, you know, going through a novel pathway on the FDA, is probably just the opposite. They're, you know, this is job number 3 or 4. They've been doing it for a long time. They've got 25, 30 years experience. Very, very different skill sets, cultures, and in some cases, almost, generations in
Yeah.
terms of their attitudes and the like. So it's a fascinating interaction. I've been pleased. Ours has worked really, really well. The data scientists, I think, have enjoyed learning about the business and medicine and what they can do and understanding how they can use their skills to make a real change in how patients are managed. I think they get a lot of job satisfaction from doing that, from applying their skills in a healthcare way. And, my more hardcore traditional scientists have learned to think differently because data science is the opposite. Like, we were all trained that you had to have a hypothesis and then you designed an experiment and you proved the null hypothesis, and that's what you did. Data science can be just the opposite. It's like, give me a bunch of data and I'll go figure out what it means. And when you say, well, how does it work? Sometimes the answer is, I have no idea. I just know that it does. If you put these things together, you are able to find a pattern, and that pattern is able to give you the answer. And you may not know what inputs came in that answer. So fascinating to put those cultures together. And I've actually found it a lot of fun. It was invigorating, I think, for the older folks on my team.
I think it's really interesting because, when you have these like cross sections, these contrasts that overlap each other, that's where you really have like real innovation. And I don't just mean like product innovation, but I mean innovation in the way you think about things, in the way you problem solve, in the quality of the discussions that you have around the table. And so it's fascinating. And Canary Medical is one of the companies that's really at the forefront of doing that and setting the example for the medtech industry as far as that goes.
Well,
So
you make a very good point, and I'm going to butcher this. I'm not even going to attempt to do the quote correctly, but one of my co-founders is Michael Rayner, and he co-authored a couple of the disruptive business theory books with Clay Christensen, and he really is an academic expert of what true disruption is. But if you look at some of Clay's original work, he said just what you said, that a lot of times true disruption is not some seismic invention. It's taking two disparate pieces and putting them together in a unique architecture. And that creates features and benefits that hadn't been present before. It's, combining a keyboard with a cell phone, right? Or with a phone. Those are the types of things that can change the world. And it's not necessarily that, you invented cold fusion. And so that's what I feel is happening here. We talked before we started of what I think is the inevitability of data being an integral part of the practice of medicine and the design of implants and everything. And the first time you smash them together, you get some very interesting outputs. And a lot of disruption is really just taking expertise from outside and bringing it in and seeing what happens.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be fascinating following your journey and Canary's journey now in 2024. What can we expect to see?
We've gotten through the first part. There was a lot of technical hurdles to putting something inside a human bone and deriving data every day from someone wandering around in the wild. And it took a while to work that all out. I think we're not perfect, but we've solved a lot of those problems. Now we're into the thousands and thousands of patients. The big data exercise is becoming quite interesting. And so I think initially we were able to monitor patients, see how they were doing, tell whether they were on a good trajectory or a bad. Just back to my clinical practice days, I think that's really important. Early identification of people who are falling behind and targeting them for follow-up is, I think, is really revolutionary. But we're now getting to enough of a data asset that we're starting to be able to say, hey, can we tell why people aren't doing as well? Is this an early sign of an infection or a DVT or something like that? And getting into diagnostics. And then the last hurdle, I think, and where I really hope we go, is that the whole world, everybody wants personalized care. Everybody wants to feel that their treatment plan is their treatment plan, not a treatment plan for everybody that they're being wedged into. And I think that's impossible to solve from a medical perspective. We don't have enough clinicians to have one-on-one care. The the at-home visit, the house call is probably not making a comeback anytime soon. But, this can become the house call. And if people are able to look at their data, follow their own journey, see their own metrics, know and understand when they make a change, actually seeing the benefit or the detriment of that change, as to whether what they're doing is helping or making things worse, then I think you start to get towards personalized care. And the only way to bridge that, we're never going to be able to do it person to person. We're going to have to do it digitally. And that to me is really where I want to see this go. I want to see, patients feeling like every day somebody is looking after them. And somebody is providing feedback that they find useful in their recovery. And if you think about what we all do for a living, which is in medtech, most of the people we were dealing with just had a very significant intervention. They had an operation, they had a device put in their body. A lot of this stuff's not trivial stuff. Yeah. And so having that feedback could truly be life altering. And I'd really like to be a part of that.
Well, that's, that leads me beautifully on to my next and final question, Bill, because I'm conscious of time, but I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. You're such an interesting person. So my final question is, what is the legacy that you want to leave on the world?
That's a great question. When I was younger, I was given the Proust questionnaire. So I know everybody does the Myers-Briggs, so I know my personality type, but the Proust questionnaire kind of digs into your motivations. And what I learned about myself is that it really is invention. It really is doing something that hasn't been done before. That is really what excites me. I don't think anyone's going to build a statue of me when we're done. I don't think any of the things I'm going to do are going to be recorded in history books. But I really do enjoy developing and doing something that hadn't been done before. And in science, they have a phrase called standing on the shoulders of giants. And just to feel that you move the ball a little further down the field, I think that's really what I want to be remembered for. I hope that, 20 years from now, when digital health is something I can't even possibly imagine, that, we help move that ball just a little bit closer towards what I hope will be a better future, based on true data and less on intuition and more on facts and understanding. And if we do that, I'll be totally happy with that.
Wow, that's really inspiring and such a noble cause as well. And, I'm super excited to continue following Canary Medical and you on your journey. 2024 is going to be a super exciting year. I know it. Bill, it's been amazing having you on the show today. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And to everybody who's listening, don't forget to give this episode a thumbs up, a like, a subscribe, a comment. And if you're not already, you absolutely need to be following Bill Hunter on LinkedIn and following all his really insightful posts and Canary's journey. So thank you, Bill. And to everybody else, I'll see you in a couple of weeks for another episode of Career Diaries by Elemed. Goodbye.